The very first weapons were ordinary sticks and stones, picked up by our earliest ancestors. Soon they discovered that nature could be improved. The stick was sharpened and fire-hardened and became a spear. The stone was thrown further with the aid of a sling. The history of the development of weapons had begun.
Sticks and stones, simple, effective weapons. A stone killed Goliath. Slingshot rained down on the heads of men in battle. Thrown stones entered the flesh. The slingshot was a lethal missile weapon. Hundreds of trained slingers, the shock troops of ancient armies. Flint given cutting edges to make tools or weapons, then tied to a wooden shaft. Man protected from attack. The stick became the spear. The spear became the weapon of armies, with a metal tip, a tip that penetrated. Helmet and shield were needed for defense. Shield overlapping shield, overlapping shield. The spear was given even more thrust from horseback. It became more powerful, more effective, longer and heavier. The stick had come of age. A stone picked from the ground was the perfect missile weapon. It was a good shape. And the stone was given added momentum by the sling. Stones were abundant and could be used immediately against animals and human attackers. In time, mechanical and chemical systems threw stones even further. But it was man's natural ability to throw that stimulated the process.
Humans have this ability to throw repeatedly, very rapidly. And much of human technology is actually taking advantage of this, whether it's a tennis serve or, in fact, throwing a javelin. Those are all aspects of the same kind of human capacity for throwing an object, projecting an object much further, in fact, than perhaps one can even see.
The stone and the sling are still used in 20th century trouble spots. They're simple weapons, only the targets have changed.
Up until the present day, stones are still used for a whole variety of functions. It's hard, it can cause injury to enemies, it can break apart other materials, and so it really needs no modification at all. But the simplest stone tools that we have are really just those that were formed by making an edge that could be used to cut, slash, crush, and those date well back into over 2 million years ago.
Prehistoric man learned to shape and modify flint. It's a hard stone, but it has one crucially important quality. It splinters and flakes easily to produce a very sharp edge.
The intention of making tools, actually modifying them, is to do with sophistication. And this is a tool which is probably around 1 million years old, perhaps. And you can see here that the maker has created symmetry by making two relatively mirror images out of stone, which is hard to do. Stone is not the most easy thing to work because it fractures in such an unpredictable way. But he or she has actually made this relatively symmetrical. But more than that, rather than just creating an edge for cutting, we actually know that the person that made this was right-handed. And that's because at the very end of this whole thing, they knocked off one additional flake from one side that fits perfectly for a right-handed person, for a right-handed grip. And that suggests that we not only have a hand that is a human hand, but that it's a hand that has a precision grip.
It's impossible to know how long Stone Age man took to develop sophisticated stone shaping skills. Some experts believe it took many thousands of years, and perhaps thousands more, to adapt stone tools into missile weapons.
This grip, which is a modified three-jaw chuck, is the kind of one that one uses on a cricket ball. You don't grab it like this, you grab it like this. And what that does is it allows you to put spin on it, it allows the object to sail through the air such that it takes advantage of the symmetry, and it makes it go further and with greater force. And it's my suspicion that although we didn't become bipedal in order to throw, certainly bipedalism makes us very aggressive throwers.
Street fighters around the world use the simplest weapon of attack, the stone. But for those with the skill, the sling makes the stone a far deadlier missile. This is the same weapon that was used thousands of years ago in the Bible story of David and Goliath. The young boy fells the giant champion with one lethal stone from a sling.
The biblical incident, the fight between David and Goliath, is the only thing people remember about the history of the sling. But slingers were used in armies throughout the European and Asian world, principally in antiquity, but right through to the Middle Ages as well.
We know there were slingers at the Battle of Hastings in 1066, just as there had been on battlefields for thousands of years. Most commanders knew the devastating effect of trained slingers raining deadly stones down on the heads of their enemies. Early warfare is full of references to these powerful but simple weapons.
The sling is a wonderful low-tech weapon, and all really you need is 100 feet of string and a stone, and you have a weapon that will kill at 100 paces. And that's quite good. The problem we have with the sling from an archaeological point of view is that, of course, its material remains vanish completely. String is not a thing that survives on very many archaeological sites.
Tom Richardson has made a sling based on some ancient excavated remains, and with some trial and error discovered how to use it.
At one end of the sling is a loop, and that's fitted over the second finger. At the other end, a knot, and that's placed between the index finger and thumb. This pebble weighs about 2.5 ounces and is a nice shape for slinging. It's oval rather than circular. We then place that in the pouch of the sling, using the thumb to make sure it's exactly in the middle, and that's all there is to it. The sling is now ready for a cast. The downside, of course, to the sling is to attain any kind of accuracy. You have to practice with it really from childhood. And most of the great slinging nations of antiquity were shepherds, and shepherd boys would be out with the flocks, keeping wolves and dogs away from them, shooting the odd bird on the wing, and simply practicing all day long. And that's the kind of commitment you need to be a good slinger.
Ordinary sling stones will travel very much further than a spear. Stones like these. But some ancient slingers used lethal lead ammunition, like this. It travelled further and faster than stone shot, and on impact it was enveloped by the flesh and disappeared into the body.
You only see one when it comes to kill you. The Greeks, having a wonderful sense of humour, tended not only to make these beautiful cast lead slingshot, but also to put designs on the inside of the moulds. Some, like this example here, have a thunderbolt for Zeus. Others have messages like Dexa in Greek, take that, or the name of the person they came from. The Romans, being an organised and efficient people, put the name and number of the legions to which the sling stones belonged.
Today there are no armies of trained slingers throwing personalised slingshot, but the sling is still used as a weapon, a cheap weapon for civilian street fighters, with ammunition taken from the rubble of shelled buildings. The other great ancient missile weapon, the spear, is also still used today, but its role now is very different. 400,000-year-old spear has been transformed by modern science into an aerodynamically perfect missile. It appears to have little in common with its ancient predecessor, apart from a sharp point. Yet the sporting javelin maintains close links with the early spear, and the method of throwing has changed very little in thousands of years. Replacing fire-hardened wood with a flint tip made the spear into a weapon that could inflict damage at a considerable distance. Dating prehistoric man's early development is difficult. Little evidence remains. A sharpened stick that was found embedded in the side of a frozen elephant is thought to be some 3.5 million years old. Flint is much more recent. Around 2 million years ago, man was shaping flint-tipped spears to throw and to hold on to. He knew that a thrown spear could miss its target, leaving him unprotected. So holding onto a second spear gave him something to defend himself with if the animal or enemy turned and attacked him. Later, man learned to extend the range of his spear by using a spear thrower. This fitted onto the end of the spear, giving added mechanical leverage to the throwing arm. Fire existed naturally long before man worked out how to produce it. Man's fear of fire, shared with animals, may have delayed the discovery of how to make it and use it. But the lightning that started fires must have stimulated early man's interest enough for him to try and find out how to harness it for himself. It takes a great deal of time and patience, and an understanding of what will and will not burn. The sparks eventually ignite the tinder and grass, producing smoke, then flame. Creating and controlling fire moved man into a new era of technology. Fire gave him warmth, kept animals at bay, and cooked his food. Once man made and controlled fire, he soon learned to smelt ores and forge metals, to make better tools and weapons. Weapons which were used when tribal conflict turned into organized warfare. These metal weapons were much more practical and durable than flint and stone. They could be made into many different shapes, used time after time, sharpened again and again. They were reliable, and they could be produced in large numbers, enough to supply a whole army. By about 600 BC, when the Greek city-states emerged as one of the most sophisticated civilizations the world had ever seen, their victorious armies of hoplite soldiers were still carrying spears. They were heavily armoured. Their armour, spears and shield could weigh as much as 34 kilos. The formidable hoplites fought in a tight formation called the phalanx.
This was a formation of men heavily armoured with leg guards, helmets that covered their whole faces, and these round shields. And they fought very close to each other, with the shields actually overlapping. As you'll notice, this shield covers your left-hand side very, very well. It gives you great protection from the chin right the way down to nearly the knees. But it leaves this side, the unguarded side, open. And the next man would move up right close to you so that his shield overlapped yours and gave you protection, as you would be doing to the next man. And you actually fought between the darts, between the two shields, the open dart shape.
The hoplites were expert spearmen. We know that their battle tactics were extremely successful until they came up against the legendary Macedonian phalanx. The Macedonians developed a new spear that completely overwhelmed the Greeks.
It wasn't until about 350 BC that the Macedonian king Philip II, the father of Alexander the Great, introduced something entirely different into the tactics. He armed his men with a double-handed spear, a pike. These were about 18 feet, 19 feet long, and the result was that when they formed up in their phalanx, which was exceedingly deep, 16 ranks deep, sometimes even 32 ranks deep, 5 spears stuck out beyond the front rank. It was almost like a hedgehog in effect. And with these, they literally, by brute force, charged the classical Greek phalanx and drove it off the field.
This is a section of the Macedonian phalanx, a unit of 256 men, each carrying a shield and wielding this apparently cumbersome spear over 5 meters long.
The thing is, of course, exceedingly heavy, weighing about 10 pounds. But some of this weight is taken by the left hand, which goes through the shield and through a strap just round the wrist, grips here, and the strap going round your neck makes it possible for a lot of the weight to be taken by the head and the back rather than the arms, with the result that you could use these over a fair length of time.
The first 5 ranks of men attacked the enemy with lowered spears, the men behind with theirs raised but ready for use.
From its beginning about 350 BC until about 150 BC, the phalanx was considered to be absolutely invincible. Its great problem was the fact that it was totally inflexible. Once you were in position, you couldn't turn, you couldn't do anything. You had to fight on flat ground, you couldn't fight where there were obstacles in the way. Once you're beyond the points, there's nothing the Macedonian can do. He can't turn, he can't do anything. He's just dead.
Alexander the Great's phalanx won many victories, once defeating 200 charging Indian war elephants in 327 BC. But ultimately, even they were defeated by an even more formidable army. The Romans had to fight many battles to conquer and extend their empire. An empire that covered thousands of square miles, from Britain in the far north south through France and Spain, along the north coast of Africa to Arabia in the east, and back through most of Europe. For centuries, some of their toughest enemies were the Germanic and Celtic tribes from northern and central Europe, whom the Romans called barbarians. Tall and fearsome fighters, with a ferocious charge, they proved a constant threat to the Roman legions.
The Romans had to do now what they'd so often had to do later, to take stock of the situation and develop a system to deal with this, and they developed the pilum.
The pilum was used in a variety of successful adaptations by the Romans for 500 years. As we can see from these slow-motion images, when the pilum enters a Roman shield, the point goes through and the heavier shaft bends. This weapon, the pilum, has been called the most sophisticated spear ever made.
This was a long javelin with a very long iron shank and a wooden shaft below it with a barbed point. This weapon, when the enemy, the Celts, charged, these big men with their slashing swords, the Romans charged back, and about 20 meters, 20 yards away from them, they threw these. They hit the shield, they go straight through the shield, and they hit the man behind. If they fail to go through the shield, if they get as far as this point, then they stick in the shield, and the enemy can't get it out. He therefore tries to shake it out, and finally has to throw away his shield and fight undefended. If they don't actually pierce the shield at all, then the sheer velocity of them would make this part bend, or if it hits the ground, the same thing would happen, it would bend. It's a non-returnable weapon, you can't throw it back. But the main thing is it distracts the enemy, it terrifies them, and it possibly kills them, by which time, the moment you'd recovered from that, the Romans were on you.
The pilum eventually disappeared, but the Roman shield wall tactic, learned from the Greeks, continued to influence European warfare. The Roman army's testudo, or tortoise, was a brilliantly simple shield formation. Highly maneuverable, it protected troops from missile attack. There were stories of chariots running over the formation to test its strength. Lines of men, protected by shields, were still dominating Europe's battlefields long after the empire disappeared and Europe entered its dark age.
What happened to warfare after the collapse of the Roman Empire? Was there a military decline in the dark ages that followed? Or did the barbarian tribes, some of whom after all had defeated Rome in the field, maintain a high standard of military technique and technology? What actually changed on the battlefield?
The armies that came after the Romans lacked their discipline and drill. In Europe, they were barely armies at all, often only small bands of men who attacked for food and possessions rather than control and domination. The Vikings were typical of these Dark Age fighting men.
The Vikings were, in a sense, the outsiders from European society, or mainstream European society. They were the scavengers at the gate, and therefore they might not have the same dedicated commitment to discipline and drill that regular soldiers such as the old Roman legions would have had. The Viking organization might be centered just around a single boatload of warriors who went out raiding, perhaps 30 men in a boat. And so they would seize what they could when they found a soft target like a monastery or a rich farm. And when it came to more serious battles against properly organized troops, then they had a very hard time usually.
But many myths still attach themselves to the bravery of the Viking warrior. Exaggerated stories about exceptional strength and great feats of endurance. The most remarkable of these warriors earned a special name, the Berserkers.
Well, there is a myth of the so-called berserker, who was a type of warrior who was supposed to get himself enraged into a battle fury by the use of various expedients such as magic mushrooms or perhaps some type of epileptic fit. Nobody quite knows what. There's a lot of mythology about that. Personally, I don't believe that they really existed, except in the imaginations or in the tales around the Lord's Mead Hall.
But the Vikings still keep their awesome reputation as fearless warriors who could throw 2 spears at once or cut their enemy in half with a single blow. Violent tales that terrified opponents.
But how did they actually fight in these dark ages? For evidence of this, we have to turn to the literature of the period, although we must realise that it's not entirely reliable. To the tales of Saxon and Viking heroes, tales that were told at the time around the fire in the Lord's Hall, tales which were only later written down. Tall tales, perhaps, but tales told to warriors who knew all about fighting. And this literature is full of mentions of shield walls. Shield walls clash, shield walls hold, and shield walls are smashed. But what was a shield wall?
It appears the warriors of the Dark Ages, like the soldiers of Imperial Rome, used the shield wall both to defend and attack.
Well, this reconstructed Viking formation looks remarkably similar, with its overlapping shields and its hedge of spears, to the tight formation of the legions of Imperial Rome.
The shield wall probably looked something like this. Whether they marched in step as they advanced is not known, but the effect of a formation of men, probably only a few ranks deep, closely grouped together behind their overlapping shields, wielding their weapons and shouting as they charged, is referred to in the tales and sagas. And it must have had a psychologically disturbing effect on the enemy, when a stronger, well-organized wall would smash through a weaker one. Both the Normans, who invaded and conquered Britain in 1066, and the Saxons they defeated, adopted a similar shield wall tactic on the battlefield. They had overlapping kite-shaped shields, designed to give more protection to the legs and feet, but they used them in the same way the Vikings had. It seems that battles moved through a number of set phases. In the early stages, the shield wall kept its tight formation to protect the men behind, men equipped with missile weapons. Most Viking and Norman battles began with a rain of slingshot and arrows. This was followed by spears thrown at the enemy by light infantry from behind the shield wall. But we don't really know what happened after the spears had been thrown. Swords would have been drawn, but any attempt to fight with them was hampered by the lack of space to wield your weapon. Man pressing on man, shield to shield, made fighting very difficult. One recent and interesting theory suggests that the shield wall sometimes actually opened to allow more fighting space. Man was still covering man, but the increased area around them meant their swords could be wielded with greater effect and force. The small gaps in the wall gave a further advantage. The archers, previously behind the shield wall and able to shoot only at long range over the heads of the front rank, could now come forward and shoot with greater accuracy, point blank, at the closing enemy, and then move back behind the cover of the shields. As we see in the next episode of Slings and Spears, shield walls needed discipline to stand firm against a frightening threat. Cavalrymen, armed with spears, cavalry whose traditions for glorious bravery were to last into the 20th century.
These earliest and simplest of weapons were so successful that, as we saw in the last episode, for thousands of years and through enormous improvements in technology, they continued to be used effectively in battle by armies fighting in ordered and disciplined ranks.
The stone, man's first weapon, both for hunting and self-defense. The sling, a killing low-tech missile that made the biblical David's reputation. Then the spear, first just a stick sharpened, or with a flint head lashed to its end, used for throwing or stabbing. Later made more deadly by forging a strong, reliable head from metal. This more formidable spear became the weapon of the heroes and warriors of the Greek city-states. Warriors who by 600 BC fought in sophisticated and disciplined formations, with spear and shield. Weapons and tactics that were adapted and refined by the Romans, until their empire fell, leaving Europe to its dark ages. But as we see in this episode, tribal warfare was still dominated by the spear and shield.
Throughout its long history, the spear has been adapted to keep pace with changes on the battlefield. In the form of a bayonet on a gun, it is still in use. So too the sling. It became mechanized into massive stone-throwing engines, themselves the forerunners of gunpowder artillery, which is still with us today.
There were no throwing machines at the Battle of Hastings, but for the Anglo-Saxons there was a new twist to the story. Spears, thrown at them with force from charging horses. For Saxons used to fighting shield wall to shield wall, man against man, the Norman horsemen posed a new and unpredictable threat. Warfare always had a different dimension once cavalry was involved. The cavalry had to charge into a first-wave barrage of slingshot and arrows, hoping that the men behind the shield wall would lose their nerve. The horseman's nerve had to hold against the second wave of spears and finally axes, until he could throw his own spear at close range. If the shield wall held firm, all the cavalry could do was retreat. Cavalry may have been a new threat to the Anglo-Saxons, but the Romans made extensive use of cavalry as well as infantry, armed with shield, spear and sword. Horsemen carrying spears were an important part of Roman battlefield tactics. The Roman cavalryman was trained to mount his horse from the right, from the left and from the rear at speed. The training was then repeated, carrying shield and spear. When thrown, it was raised above the head. It could also be used for an overarm stab and for close-quarter thrusting underarm directly into the enemy, the grip changing to give a strong forward thrust. A Norman cavalryman was little more than a foot soldier on horseback. He carried the same shield and spear and probably spent as much time off his horse fighting on the ground as he did riding it on the battlefield. But he used the spear in much the same way as the Romans, in a number of practiced manoeuvres, but with one very important exception. The Norman cavalryman used the same underarm and overarm stabbing movements as his Roman predecessors, but was now seated more firmly on his horse, because of stirrups. A platform the Romans never had. It gave him more power as he could couch his spear, holding it underarm and charging straight at the enemy with full force. Cavalry was at its most dangerous when enemy formations broke up, and it could pursue fleeing soldiers. Separated from their units and running away on open ground, they had virtually no chance.
Like their comrades on foot, mounted men could use their spears for throwing or stabbing. In the Western world, the fashion changed at about 1066, the year of the Battle of Hastings. Thereafter, mounted men increasingly carried their spears under their arms, so that the full weight of horse and man could be applied to an enemy.
The mighty medieval knight had arrived on the battlefields of Europe, clad from head to foot in armour. What made him so formidable was the couched spear held rigid under his arm, which transferred all the power of the charging horse through the rider to his target.
Increasingly, spears grew longer and were soon the lance, one of the characteristic weapons of the mounted knight.
The armour is German, 1480 period, so the end of the 15th century. It weighs about 80 pounds with all the mail that you can see on the underside of the arming jacket and such like. Because the weight's nicely distributed about the body, it makes it actually relatively easy to wear once you've had a reasonable amount of practice and you have an armour that's designed for you. You have to be a reasonable horseman to start off with, and that obviously helps. And once you're in that position, then it's trying to gain the position of the medieval knight, and that's very different from modern riding. You can see with my legs that they're thrust forward and the heels right down, and that gives you a lower centre of balance on the horse, and also gives you a steady platform to be able to use the lance. We're concentrating on getting the horse to go straight line, and that's done through the weight distribution of your weight on the saddle, because the hands, the right hand is generally holding a lance, the left hand is holding onto the reins, but you only have a certain amount of feeling through the reins to the horse's mouth, and so you really have to rely on your weight distribution to be able to do it. A lot of things to think about, but the most important is to remain calm. The things I think about is how the horse is reacting to the weight of the armour and to those things around it. I have to concentrate on giving the horse direction and the right aids at the right moment. And this is difficult when wrapped in armour. But that comes with practice, and if you've got an armour that fits you and designed for you, it makes it relatively easy. And the strength in holding the lance comes from gripping it tightly under the armpit. And then we've got the moment of contact. So the horse is now travelling at 25 miles an hour, and I'm wrapped in 6 odd stone of armour, looking through 6 millimetres of visor. It can get quite exciting.
The heyday of the heavily armoured knight was short-lived, but the combination of spear and horse carried on into a new era of highly mobile fighting men. Along the lawless borders of 16th century Scotland, castles like these were built as protection against an infamous group of raiders and cattle thieves known as the Border Reivers, guerrilla fighters with a fearsome reputation. The spear was their principal fighting weapon, although they also used firearms. They lived in a tangled world of blood feuds, reprisals, night raids, and arson. There had been 2,500 Border Reivers in Henry VIII's army, with a reputation as the finest cavalrymen in Europe. The Reivers were horsemen born to the saddle. Hit-and-run tactics were the key to their success. They were rarely caught by their pursuers. Their exploits became legendary and contributed to the romance and glamour associated with the fighting man on his horse. Warfare was changing rapidly in the 19th century. Huge guns and accurate rifles should have ended the cavalry's role forever, but it didn't. Against massive firepower, the commanders, often old cavalrymen themselves, still believed a man and his horse were battle winners. The cavalry officer, too, never doubted the shock of the charge would melt the enemy's resolve. The courage of these cavalrymen was celebrated. They had to do or die, and the heroic mile-long charge of the Light Brigade into the Russian guns at the end of the Valley of Death at Balaclava was an act of considerable gallantry as well as folly. Many were blown apart by the concentrated fire of massed artillery long before they reached the enemy.
Lances came back into military use in the 19th century, not only in Europe, but even in North America, where there was a single Lancer regiment in the Union Army in the American Civil War. These new lances were much lighter and shorter than their medieval predecessors. They were made of bamboo, ash, or even aluminium. They could be much more effective than a sword, but they required a lot of skill to be used properly. In 1914, some British soldiers saw German lancers throw away their weapons because they were simply too hard to manage in the hand-to-hand struggle.
The confidence that many commanders had in the shock of cavalry and the lance died in the First World War. They were no match for machine guns and artillery. But the foot soldier's spear never disappeared from the battlefield. In fact, it enjoyed a surprising revival. In all the most important battles of the English Civil War, the pike played a decisive role. This spear, over 5 meters long, and once the feared weapon of Alexander the Great's Macedonian phalanx in the 4th century BC, was revived in late European medieval warfare. But what seems surprising is it was still used in the 17th century, 100 years after firearms became the great killers on the battlefield. At the Battle of Marston Moor in 1644, both royalist and parliamentarian infantry were armed with this unwieldy weapon. They would advance towards each other, literally trying to push their opponents off the battlefield. This tactic was called push of pike.
The pike's obvious advantage was to keep its user's body well away from the enemy. But the price of this was a cumbersome weapon that required not only individual skill, but collective training. Historians aren't really sure when drill, as we would understand it, came in. But pikemen were certainly doing drill in the 16th century, and by the 17th century, there were a variety of drill books showing people how to use this effective, but rather difficult weapon.
Even with all the advantages of sound knowledge and practical advice, Civil War reenactors today find pike drill very difficult to coordinate. The aim of drill was simply to discipline soldiers to perform a series of complicated movements with precision together at the same time. Drums, flutes, hand claps and singing had been used in earlier times to ensure uniform movements. But coordinated drill was vital if the pikes were to be used as part of a defence, either against cavalry or with other, rather more advanced weapons. The pike played a dramatic role in the English Civil War.
The pike survived until the early 18th century because it teamed up well with early firearms. Musketeers needed protection while they reloaded, and the pike provided that.
In fact, the combination of long pike and musket worked well, the ancient pike protecting the ranks of musketeers as they slowly reloaded their weapons. This formation of pikes and guns working together was extremely successful in defeating infantry, but more importantly, cavalry attack. The tactic relied on soundly learned drill. The tremendous noise on the battlefield made the shouting or hearing of orders practically impossible, so both pike and musket had to be coordinated to avoid defeat.
The invention of gunpowder didn't change the battlefield at a stroke. The matchlock musket, used in the 17th century, was fine when it was loaded, but when it was empty, you could only use it as a club.
The expensive, technologically advanced musket was often reduced to a crude club, one of man's earliest weapons, after it had fired its one round. The drilled and disciplined musketeer now advanced onto the battlefield to fight and defend himself with the only protection he had, the butt of his musket. It would take another 150 years to develop a gun which could safely fire more than one shot, so instead the spear, in a new form, was called out of retirement to answer the problem of the one-shot gun. At the Royal Military College Sandhurst, officer cadets parade in full-dress uniform with bayonets fixed. The bayonet evokes a powerful image of men fighting face-to-face with cold steel. Today it is more ceremonial than practical, but it's curious that the young soldiers fix their bayonets to modern automatic weapons capable of killing a man a mile away. It represents something extra on the battlefield. Like the sword, it can inspire confidence.
Even in the age of the automatic rifle, the infantry soldier still carries the bayonet. Of course, it's come a long way from the 17th century plug bayonet. The big problem with that was that when it was jammed into the musket's muzzle, you couldn't fire. You could use the matchlock musket as a pike. An early bayonet drill was exactly the same as pike drill. The socket bayonet of the early 18th century was a great improvement. It fitted round the weapon's muzzle, so that you can load and fire while the bayonet was fixed. Towards the beginning of the 19th century, sword bayonets came in. And these were really first designed for rifle-armed troops who had an accurate weapon, and they didn't want to have their bayonet fixed until the last possible moment. So they were issued with a sword bayonet, which could actually be used as a sword even when it wasn't fixed to the rifle.
There is a vivid description by a war veteran of the bayonet in action in the late 19th century Zulu wars when the British fought African warriors armed with spears called assegais.
Over and over they attacked, rushing madly up to the wall, and where they could, grabbing at the muzzles of our rifles or our bayonets. And where they could, using these or their assegais to overcome the wall. But over and over they failed. From the rapid fire of our rifles, and some healthy stabbing from our bayonets.
In 1914, the British soldier went to war in Europe for the first time in 50 years, with the bayonet. And in 1939, the British soldier returned to Europe with fixed bayonet against tanks and aircraft.
Of course, there's a good deal more to the bayonet than simply a piece of steel on the end of a rifle. Fixing it fills a soldier with confidence and gives him that courage to go the last couple of 100 meters to get to grips with the enemy.
For 300 years, the bayonet has played an important role in the development of the modern way of war.
Across the battlefields of history, relatively few soldiers were actually killed by bayonets. Of course, there were times, like the Battle of Culloden, when there was actually a fierce hand-to-hand fight. But usually, the sight of that piece of steel on the end of a rifle persuaded one side or the other to seek an urgent appointment elsewhere. They ran away rather than face the steel.
Powerful images of the American War of Independence, showing long lines of troops advancing with bayonets fixed on an enemy fleeing in disorder, made good propaganda. The reality was that many of the troops were often too inexperienced or lacked the discipline needed to stay in ordered lines. But the story of the bayonet and its development from what began as a sharpened shaft of wood powerfully illustrates the sheer diversity of one of man's earliest weapons, the spear. The extensive collection of spears at the Royal Armouries Museum, Leeds, shows how a simple weapon underwent a remarkable number of transformations.
We find spear-type weapons pretty much falling out of use by the end of the 17th century with the arrival of the bayonet. So we don't find many infantry carrying spears of one sort or another after that, except in the British Army and in some continental armies. The sergeants were equipped with a thing called a spontoon, which is essentially a simple spear between 8 and 9 feet long. Here's an example, a simple leaf-shaped blade with a crossbar. In fact, the head screws into the shaft. It's a very simple, rather mundane weapon. Well, the spontoon was principally a weapon, but its use as much as anything by sergeants was to keep their troops in line. They would be behind the rank, and they would hold the spontoon horizontally and force their troops into line, either in the advance or to make sure that they didn't break while volley firing.
Among the rare spears, halberds, bills, pikes, and other staff weapons in the collection are more humble and everyday objects.
What I've always found fascinating about weapons technology is that the old ideas keep coming back. We've seen that in the 17th century, for example, the pike ceased to exist with the arrival of the bayonet. And incredibly, in the 20th century, we saw a return of the pike during World War II, when Britain was under threat of attack from airborne forces, German airborne troops. There was an order that the Home Guard be formed, groups of men who were not of a serving age or were in reserved occupations, who formed home defence units. And of course equipment was virtually unobtainable, so they were asked to make their own weapons. And initially simply they would strap a carving knife to the end of a broom handle, but very shortly after that there was a central supply of, extraordinarily, a return of the spear, simply a British First World War bayonet welded to a piece of metal pipe. And this, in effect, was a military issue of the spear that we've seen from the Middle Ages.
This crude thrusting spear, possibly the least sophisticated weapon in the Royal Armouries collection, is part of the million-year-old story of the spear. The Tower of London is steeped in history. Its beginnings go back to the Norman conquest. It's been a royal palace, an arsenal, a prison, and a grim place of execution. It was one of the world's first museums open to the public, and it is still the home of the English crown jewels. Today, the thousands of visitors who come to look at London's most popular tourist attraction still hear many of its stories and fascinating legends, told by the decoratively uniformed yeoman warders associated with the tower since the 15th century, when they carried, as they still do today, a long spear called a partisan, a weapon whose roots go back to the Dark Ages. There are 42 yeoman warders, all are former NCOs in the armed forces with at least 22 years military service behind them.
I am a yeoman warder at Her Majesty's Royal Palace and Fortress, the Tower of London. A member of the Yeomen of the Guard, the Sovereign's bodyguard extraordinaire. The body of yeoman warders has been in existence for for over 450 years. King Henry VII split his personal guard in half, sending all tried, trusted, true members to the Tower of London to stiffen its defences. As the sovereign's personal guard, the weapon they carried was the partisan. As a fighting weapon, it's quite heavy. The staff is made of solid oak, and there's an 18-inch blade. The scroll at the base of the blade contains the royal cipher, signifying that not only was it a weapon, but it was a staff of office. Through the years, from the reign of King Henry VII and Henry VIII, the shape of the blade and the staff have changed virtually not at all. At close quarters, it's a very efficient weapon. It will punch through cloth and body flesh with ease, as some of my colleagues have found to their cost, and picking them up rather carelessly.
As long as there are queens and kings of Britain, they will be protected by ceremonial as well as deadly weapons. The simple stick with a sharpened point is still with us.